Dave Moutrey. I'm Director and Chief Executive of Home. See, first slip already. And I'm also Director of Culture for the City of Manchester. I'm now going to ask each member of the panel to introduce themselves and tell us a little bit about themselves as we start to get into the session. I'm going to start with Jumoke Abdullahi, who is, well, I'll let you talk about yourself.
Thank you very much. So my name is Jumoke Abdullahi. I'm one half of the Cripples, which is an organisation that I co-founded with my other half, who's actually speaking on another panel right now. And we essentially try to highlight the narratives and experiences of those at the three intersections of race, gender, and ability, and looking at these different levels of marginalisation.
Thank you. And next, I'd like to introduce you to Stef Benstead. Yep.
Hi, I'm Stef. I have had a chronic illness since 2011, which forced me to give up a PhD in conservation. And then as I had to move back in with my parents, I started to move into research on social policy, in particular looking at disability and disability benefits, and that's what I've been doing ever since.
And also live on stage, we've got Nadine Travers.
Yeah, hi everybody, my name's Nadine Travers. I have a hidden disability. I have ADHD. I was diagnosed a couple of years ago as an adult, and I have an organisation called Stand, which is supporting young people that are on the fringes of the criminal justice system. And a lot of the young people that I work with do have ADHD or undiagnosed neurodiverse conditions. So I see myself as an advocate for young people in the community. Thanks,
Nadine. Through the magic of technology, we'll shortly be seeing a video from Leena Haque, who's in conversation with Jude Kelly. She's a senior UX designer, user experience designer, and digital artist, and Neurodiversity initiative lead at the BBC. As I say, she's in conversation with Jude Kelly. And then at the end of the session, we've got our special guest, Tishani Doshi, and she'll read her powerful poem, which is in response to Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the poem, the title of the poem gives its title to this session, which is I See You, Do You See Me? I think I was asked to chair this session because I'd been part of the Manchester Poverty Truth Commission, along with Stef and Nadine, which is where I first met them. The Manchester Poverty Truth Commission set out with this question: what if people who have directly faced poverty were involved in decisions about poverty? It was an incredible journey, and it became quite a complex journey because towards the end of it we were impacted on by the COVID lockdown. But it uncovered a number of realities for me, and once you know them, you can't unknow them. I wouldn't want to unknow them either. I heard first-hand accounts of systemic state action to exclude. If you fall into poverty or are born into it, getting out of it is made very hard. If you're disabled and need help, the state is only really a last resort, and even then barely adequate, and often inadequate, and definitely traumatising and stigmatising. The systemic state exclusionism is exacerbated by a wider societal prejudice, inaction, ignorance, disinformation, and othering. I also heard a lot, in contrast, about love, community, self-help, resilience, dignity, and caring in the face of huge challenges. It's clear that being excluded means you're not seen. Yet being seen is acknowledged is essential to our dignity and being respected. The difficult truth in our society is that if we're poor or have a disability, we're less likely to be seen and acknowledged, reducing our power to make decisions in our interest. As we look to our society in the future, how can we truly recognise the value of people's dignity to see them in our environments, culture, attitudes, behaviour and decisions? What is the power of art for people to be seen and for others to see and hear from those they might not? How do we take that artistic power into society more broadly. So, we're now going to hear from Leena Haque via video. This is the conversation with Jude Kelly.
Last year, pre-COVID, I directed a play for Radio 4, and it starred an autistic actress, quite a young actress, and it was about an autistic young woman who was creating her own podcast to explain neurodiversity, partly for her mum's sake, and to everybody else listening, and to demonstrate that actually she didn't need solving. What she needed was to take a place as an equal member of society along everybody else, and to talk about neurodiversity as an expert, because she had that lived experience. And it was a great play to direct because it was a provocation, really, to everybody who just had an assumption through the way you're educated, the way you grew up, that there's normal and then there's not normal. You've championed an enormous amount of rethinking around this neurodiverse space. And I wondered if you could talk about, like, what was the trigger moment that made you think, I'm going to redesign the way that spaces are thought about, the way that people are thought about, and the way that institutions operate?
Well, basically with neurodiversity is about, looking at people who have differently wired brains with conditions like ADHD, autism, etc. And you've got Tourette's syndrome, dyspraxia. It's an umbrella term for a vast number of conditions, and it's growing. And there's almost a movement, so to speak. So noticing it in terms of from a creative perspective as well. I mean, historically, there was negative connotations and stigma attached to, having a condition like autism. For neurodiversity, it basically describes the natural variation in human cognitive function. It recognises the value and, that goes behind people with different thinking styles. And I myself identify as neurodivergent, being on the autism spectrum and having ADHD. So for me, I suppose growing up with it, there was a lack of understanding around it in general, and it was mostly about the challenges and negativity around it. And the opportunities were scarce, and there were also not many people like myself that I could look up to or seek guidance and make me feel like I was okay, that I fit in the world. So for me, going through the different challenges in life that I had in education through to employment made me realise things have got to be better. I mean, I don't think any child should grow up with an uncertain future, and a lot of kids are, with these kinds of conditions. So that kind of spurred me on, really, to think the book stops with me, or anyone else who wants to join me in this sort of movement, I guess. So a lot of the work that I do as a designer is about removing barriers, but I've quickly realised that the more I try to remove barriers, the more barriers keep coming at you as you try and remove barriers, which happens to a lot of people working in inclusion.
Can you give some examples? I know you're a senior designer at the BBC, and that this is kind of one of your kind of key areas, which is, make sure the user experience is available for all ways, all brains are wired. But what obstacles are you overcoming, and then all of a sudden another one comes in front of you, like some sort of dreadful game that you can never win?
The environment in general can be inaccessible and difficult to use. Say if you're on the autism spectrum, you may feel anxious about going into busy places or crowded areas. Using public transport can be quite challenging. You may have sensory issues where sounds can be much more heightened and amplified, and it can be quite an overwhelming experience. So what would happen is you would avoid those kinds of places. You feel like you can't go to those places. So it could be a concert or a football match or utilising public transport. Those basic things that we all sort of take for granted, a lot of people with these hidden neurological conditions would struggle to gain access to. And I think historically accessibility has always been known to be about physical accessibility, so anyone with a physical disability or condition, whereas when it comes to neurodiversity, I think a lot more people are impacted. As we know, the numbers are that 1 in 7 of us are neurodivergent. So it's a lot of people, nearly 20% of the population are impacted.
Leena, talk to us about what allyship can look like.
For me, allyship is about lifting others up by advocating and sharing opportunities. Be the reason why someone feels seen, heard and supported, whether they're teachers or managers at work. For me, good allyship is about making space for others, taking a step to one side, allow the underrepresented individuals to have a voice. Allyship is actually something that is a lifelong process. And for me, I feel the sort of little privilege that I've managed to gain just by, working in what I do, paying it forward for me is really important, and recognising the privilege that people have and utilising it to support and encourage and promote those people who don't have the benefit of that same privilege is really important. And that for me is the crux of allyship. If more people can think about this, recognise this, we'll be able to create change much more quickly. We need more and more better allies in positions of privilege who can help to remove the societal barriers that exist to maintain the status quo.
Just on the final point, I know that you've drawn attention to the Moutrey word for autism.
Take Watanga, it's the Maori word for autism, and it basically means in his or her time or place. And that simple concept, if people were to sort of understand that a bit better, you can actually grow an understanding around neurodiversity. It's about allowing people to be able to do things in their own time and place, that flexibility. And that compassion, I suppose, is really important. How do we provide and offer people the support they need with the dignity and respect that they deserve? How do we give them the time and space that they need? And for me, a big part of what I do is about co-designing, bringing people in to the design process, rather than just seeing them as users or clients. It's like working collaboratively with the people, listen, understand, provide a safe place, empathise. That will make the difference, basically.
So Leena talks very clearly there about neurodiversity and the lack of wider understanding of the conditions or the disabling factors in our environment or society. I was very interested in that notion there of in his or her time and place and creating space for people. And also she spoke very powerfully there about collaboration and safe spaces. So if I can come to you now, Jumoke.
Yeah.
You've travelled the world extensively and written on your blog about accessibility and inaccessibility. And by the way, as a former Sambista, I'd love to have gone to Salvatore in Bahia. So there's some serious travel envy going on here. Where in the world did you have good experiences of inclusion? And what was good about it?
I think there's more than one place, I would say, that I've had a good experience of inclusion within traveling and whatnot. But often what I find is that the places that are considered poorer, shall we say, by certain societal standards, regarding GDP, etc., they're more likely to go out of their way to be assistive of people. It's just kind of in my own experience, there's often kind of an apologetic nature. It's sorry that we don't have this, but within us, within, me, myself, or this, small community in which you found yourself, we will be able to assist you. Is it the case that you need me to hold your bag for you? Is it that, you need to rest your, hand on my shoulder to be able to get you up? It's any sort of way that they'll be able to assist. And what I often find is that in places where community is held in very high regard and working collectively, that I've actually been able to find more assistance there. And in places like the UK, where we value the individual over the collective, it's just kind of oh, that's something that you do and you kind of get on with it. So I think community is often something that we don't consider when we're looking at inclusivity, because they're very aware of the things that are lacking, but they're like, there's an ingenuity in there that, you know, we will be able to figure this out. Unfortunately, the downside of that is that you do rely on the kindness of strangers. And then, unfortunately, if there's a case of, if the strangers aren't there, or if the strangers aren't there and there is no kindness, so that kind of puts disabled people in an awkward position that you're relying on or beholden to the assistance of those around you, which is why you need the systems in place. And like Leena had mentioned, looking outside of physical and mobility related disabilities, and ensuring that these things are in place, but also valuing the community within that, because that is absolutely crucial, because a space such as this could be as accessible as could be in terms of tactile, sensory. They could have all of the lifts and all of the ramps, but if within the space you do not feel welcome, then everything else falls flat.
Yeah, welcome community, very clearly,
Absolutely,
very
the
important.
spirit needs to be there.
Yeah. So from those experiences, what do you think are the key things that we can learn in the place that we're in now, here?
Right. I think certainly we have to start thinking collectively, and we have to consider interdependence. We're always going to rely on one another. So whether you have a disability or you don't, you're going to need other people, you know, throughout this journey of life, no matter where you are, if it's a particular situation, a particular place, like let's say university, for example, and you're trying to ace the next test. You need to be able to rely on those within your seminar classes, the teachers, the lecturers, etc. So understanding that we will always need each other, and not looking at that in and of itself as a negative, because we are, you know, going through this world together. And I think it's certainly something that we have to consider, that we owe to one another. Like, we have to get through this life together, so why would I not help you? Because this is a collective effort.
Right. And so obviously all of these collective experiences impact on your work more broadly. Can you tell us about a project that typifies your work with the Triple Cripples in changing cultural attitudes and asserting your space and building up community?
Yes, absolutely. So the work that myself and my other half, Kim Oliver, shout out Kim, do is that we're trying to go from the outside in. So whenever we're talking about those that are marginalized, those that are oppressed, these are things that didn't just happen. There have been agents that have very active roles. It's like these are the purposefully unheard or the purposefully misheard. And it's a case of this, it's within these margins, within these areas, within these outskirts, that we actually need to pull people in. And often it is said that the hardest people to reach are at the outskirts. But that's actually, I believe, to be a fallacy, because the easiest people to reach are those at the fringes, because you've pushed them in such, you know, a place where they're in plain sight, but often ignored. It's not that you can't see them, it's that you actively ignore them. And for us, it's actually the people with the power that have the access, that have the money, that have everything essentially, that are the most difficult to be able to access. Like, if I wanted to reach out to Mark Zuckerberg right now, I can't. Like, how would I? I can't even talk to somebody on the phone from Facebook as an organization, you know, and this is somewhere where a lot of power is being held. And for us, it's important to highlight these narratives, because it's only when we look at the lived experience of the people that have been so far pushed out that we can actually see what needs to be done and what needs to be changed. Because they are so far outside, they have actually a greater, broader view of the things that might be missed by those in the center. It's like, oh, well, it's not an issue because of these different axes of privilege that I have. I don't see what the problem is because it has yet to affect you. But until it does, then nothing is going to change. But if you talk to those that are oftentimes at the closest point of violence, be they queer, be they disabled, be they ethnic minorities, religious minorities, be they poor, you know, poverty is something, unfortunately, that ties all of these marginalized communities together. then nothing is really going to change. And what we do and try to do with the Triple Cripples, and a project that we're currently working on, is the Living Archive. So history is essentially made up of the stories that we have deemed worthy of remembering. And it's often, stories of people, like us on this stage, that it just kind of like gets washed away with the annals of history. It's like, let's actually record these experiences of the people that are here right now, so that those that are coming afterwards will be able to use the Living Archive as a point of reference, that you are not actually alone. These are lives that have been lived before, and we're trying to move things inch by inch a little bit better, so that the conversations that we're having now, the things that we're trying to fix now, have already been fixed, and we can move on to the next thing.
Thank you. I'd recommend the Triple Cripples website to you, by the way. There's some really interesting stuff on there. It's worth
As would
going
I.
back. Pardon?
I said, as would I.
Yes, indeed. I'm going to come now to Stef. Stef, you and I first met as commissioners on the Poverty Truth Commission, and I was always in awe of your ability to cut through and see the essence of an issue as we were talking. And so in your research into social security systems for the sick and disabled people, do you see systemic exclusionism making people invisible, or am I just misunderstanding what I heard from you in the Poverty Truth Commission, or what I heard in the Poverty Truth Commission?
No, there's definitely systemic exclusion, and a lot of the research that I've done is focused in particular on chronic illness, rather than a more traditional disability like being blind or deaf or paralysed. Because what we've found in the chronic illness community, and I suspect that this crosses over into mental illness and neurodiversity, is that we're very often disbelieved by all the relevant professionals around us. So it's all the doctors and healthcare professionals on the one side, and then it's the Department for Work and Pensions and all the benefit assessors on the other, who can look at me, and if I'm not wearing a back support and feeling half asleep, then generally I look very well. And in fact, just last Sunday, I had someone approach me and say, "You look really well today, better than I've seen you for ages." And I was like, this is the worst I felt for a very long time. I am so utterly exhausted. So you can't often see what's wrong with someone when it's a chronic illness. You can't measure it in the way that you can measure someone's sight or hearing or the ability to move their legs. So it's really easy to just dismiss it and to say that it's not real, or that it's to label physical health problems as though they're mental health problems, and therefore they're not really an issue. If you would just, I don't know, believe you were well, you would be well. And when that happens from the medical profession, it means you don't get the treatment that you need. It means it's really hard to go to your employer and get the reasonable adjustments that you need. And if you can't work or you need extra support at home, it's really hard to get the benefits that you need. So you have all these professionals acting as gatekeepers to the support that is really important to enable you to live a decent life. And you can't get it because there's this big culture of disbelief.
And I mean, apart from the actual not getting the things that you need, what are the other impacts on people on the receiving end of this?
It's really demoralising, and I can't really express until you've felt it. If you, for example, I applied for personal independence payment to get support at home, and one of my assessors, who was a paramedic, so he's trained in emergency medicine, not chronic health conditions, just wrote over and over again that what I'd said was not consistent with my medical condition. And I felt like he had judged me as a liar, that he thought I was a scrounger and a cheat and worthless in society, and that I just needed to be kicked out the system in order to learn to behave. And when it doesn't need many assessments like that to make you terrified of all of them, and the thing is, it's quite a lot of assessments that come back like that. So there's a horrible feeling that you get of being looked down upon by the very people that you most depend on to get what you need. And that makes it, each time it gets increasingly harder to go to your doctor to ask for health care, to apply to the DWP for the benefits that you need, to go to your employer to ask for reasonable adjustments, or even just in society, you know, if you want to go to the gym or you want to go to the theatre and you need to phone up and say, look, have you got this access or that access? It gets harder every time to ask for that, and you have to have a really good network of people around you who believe in you and believe that you are ill in order to maintain any kind of self-esteem and identity and the feeling that you are a good moral person like everyone else.
So how do we empower people that are experiencing this so that they can be seen and heard, authentically and understood?
I think the biggest thing is to believe people when they tell you something, not to dismiss it in any way, but to listen, and if someone says they need certain help, then to give it to them. But also more generally, we have a sort of a narrative in society that poor people have a really bad work ethic, people are just malingering, they don't want to work, and that we need austerity. But actually, the data is that this country has a really strong work ethic. People who are only ever experienced bad jobs or who've only ever experienced trying to work through chronic illness still want to work. And if we can change that narrative, so when you're talking to people around you, just start to change the narrative and say, actually, the UK has a really strong work ethic. Actually, people who say they're sick have multiple health problems that are genuine barriers, and that what we need is not to cut the support that people get in order to drive them into somehow becoming better, healthy and wealthy. But actually, if we support people, and if we give people more support than they need, that's not going to be a problem, because actually people who are supported will then start to get the capacity to go out and do the things that they want to do to contribute and take part in society. And support will see people go into better jobs and better mental health if they've been struggling with self-esteem and so on, and better physical health, because if you're not worn out chasing benefits all the time, you're going to have better physical health. So we need to change that narrative from one of Britain is lazy to one of actually supporting people helps build a stronger society.
It became very clear through the journey that certainly I went on in the Poverty Truth Commission, that sort of Victorian narrative of the worthy and the unworthy poor is still out there. It's still, and it seems to be hardwired into the state that we live in. I'm going to turn now to Nadine. And so we went on that journey together. What were your big takeaways from the Poverty Truth Commission?
One of the most powerful moments for me was to see change happen along the way. One of the key things of the Poverty Truth Commission was nobody knew who anybody else was, so there was civic and business leaders in the room with grassroots commissioners, like myself and Stef, and you couldn't work out who was who because nobody had badges on, nobody had, a place, so there was an equal platform. And through relationship building and being human, I think for me is the humanity that was brought into the equation by the Poverty Truth Commission, is that we was on a level playing field with each other. I think a conversation that we had, so I identify as an adult care leaver, which I forgot to say earlier. I was having a conversation with Dave one time, just general, and he shared about Home have cinema tickets for people from low socio-economic backgrounds. And I was quite surprised at that because the theatre is quite a middle-class activity because of the cost in coming to a place like this. You've got your travel, you've got your ticket, you've got, you need a drink, or you're going to sneak something in your bag or whatever, And that door kind of opened, and I was able to share that information with a city council. I can't remember her position now, but she then put that on the agenda of all care leavers in Manchester up to the age of 25 could access that provision that home has there. And I accessed that for some of the young people that I work with. And it didn't take 2 years to do that. There wasn't, 20 meetings to decide whether, that could happen. It happened. So that was key for me in, because people are deemed as poor, then we shouldn't be enjoying, these things, So that was one of the key moments for me, I think, in change happening quite quickly, where historically, the computer says no scenario, or there's so much red tape, or, it kind of, gets forgotten about. So, yeah, that for me, in things happening quickly.
So, you've worked a lot in various health, social care, education settings and community settings. And you touched on culture earlier, but what role do you think arts and culture can play in those settings and enabling people to be seen?
Allowing people into the buildings, for one. I work with a lot of young people that are deemed antisocial. So I was saying to Dave before, they probably, they get stopped by the police if they was hanging about outside in a group, and that may escalate. So making places like this accessible and the belonging, for me, and I know a lot of the shows that are shown here touch on those issues around class and race and different things, but class is a big one that we don't often talk about, because we think, well, that's kind of oldie worldly, but we have a class system that's still, very much prevalent today. So for me, is that home do a really good job of that inclusivity. There's a couple of things that I'm looking at to bring some young people to. So, being in this environment and feeling like you belong, rather than being on the fringes of society. And, the young people I work with they can't get into a youth centre because it's under lock and key. Football muggers are under lock and key. Someone's got the key, they can't get in there. So then they're on the streets. And then because they're in groups meeting up, then they're deemed antisocial or, associated with antisocial behaviour, and it just kind of escalates. And these are young people that are often from the low socio-economic areas, but they're being labelled as criminals, and they, need removing off our streets. So that's kind of the narrative that I'm experiencing at the moment, and just terminology as well. And a lot of these young people are, they're in pupil referral units, so they come under SEND, special educational needs and disabilities. They do or may not have an educational healthcare plan, so that's another minefield for young people. So for me, it's about bringing young people into these spaces, taking them for meals, just different things like that, experience of life. Going for a meal is not a luxury. Watching a film's not a luxury. It's good for your well-being, it's good for, life, rather than surviving. I think that's been touched on in, because you have a disability or you are poor, you shouldn't be doing X, Y, Z. So, yeah, for me, I would feel comfortable bringing young people into this environment, definitely, 100%.
Thanks. Just to confirm, by the way, I didn't give you any money to say that about home, did I?
No, he didn't.
I was listening to Gary Young speak this morning, brilliantly, actually. It was an amazing presentation he did this morning. But what he was saying is that, I can't remember his exact words, but in essence he was saying, this government isn't the government for us, so we basically need to get on and organise ourselves. And so all three of you have touched on things that are moving us to, what we need for allyship. And there's a question that Jude Kelly asked Leena. So if I could ask each of you to think and just come up with one or two, few words about what you think allyship should look like.
I'll go last.
You go last?
Yes.
Okay.
That's cheating.
What's the question again?
About allyship. What does allyship, what does being a good ally look like?
Okay.
What, in terms of supporting each other? Anybody want to go? While you're thinking, that's my last question for the panel. In a moment, we'll get the lights up and there's questions from the audience. We'll take questions from the audience.
It's a hard question.
Yeah. Okay. Do you know what? I'm gonna dive into the fray, gang. I think for me, allyship, it looks like somebody putting their own skin in the game. So as somebody who is a black disabled woman, you know, from working class, you know, let's be honest, which is a very good point that you'd brought up. Oftentimes, whenever we think of working class, there is still that very Victorian idea, and black and non-black people of colour are rarely ever seen as working class, even though a lot of us are working class. It's like, oh no, we're not talking about you, we're talking about the poor white children, you know? It was like, well, there's also poor black children too. And for me, allyship looks like getting your skin in the game. So for those in different situations and in different places and in different environments, each three of us, while being marginalized, we also have certain privileges, certain axes where we have privilege. And if you're seeing something happening, and it's safe for you to do so, because safety is absolutely of paramount, no matter how much you want to help somebody or help a situation, if there is a genuine fear that your safety could be compromised, then that is, of course, not something for you to dive into. But if it's enough to just ask the question, if you see somebody being racially profiled or profiled because they look poor or they look like they're part of a gang only because it's like young kids hanging out outside together, it's just kind of like, actually, why are you stopping this person? Why are you stopping these people? And oftentimes the people that you're asking the question of, it all comes from the state, let's be honest. Like, the young kids are hanging outside because you've closed the youth clubs, you've closed the youth centres. They have nowhere else really and truly that they can go. And yes, places are open, but if they're not affordable, they might as well be closed, right? So for me, allyship looks like I have a certain level of privilege, whether it be through my race, my socioeconomic background, my sex or gender, or the way that I'm perceived to be. And it's just kind of like asking those questions, putting yourself in these positions, because often what we say as the triple cripples is that the onus often falls on the people that are being most harmed. It's like, oh no, just help yourself, make it better for yourself. It's like, oh, you're chronically ill. Why don't you just stop being chronically ill? And why don't you just stop being poor? Why don't you just stop being black? And it's a case of you are asking the hardest of the hardest questions of the people that don't actually have the power or the access to change very much. You need to look at the people that have created certain kinds of environments and certain kinds of situations where it's like, why are they now in the situation where they have to be hanging out outside? Why are they not able to access certain places? Who are the gatekeepers and how do we change these things? And I think these questions have to be asked of the people that have the most power and have the most privilege, because they often have the least to lose. Because it's Nadine, you were saying that in terms of the cinema situation, there's always bureaucracy, there's red tape. It's like, no, I need to talk to my manager who needs to talk to their line manager who needs to talk to their director. It's like, no, make it happen. There's reports, and reports are important because you have to have the data. It's like, oh my goodness, how do we help the poor? Give them money. How do we help the unhoused? Give them houses. And there's often a cyclical thing that happens where it seems like we're doing something. You know, it's like, oh, you feel bad. I don't want you to feel bad. It's like, okay, these are the ways in which you could help. Do these things. It's like, oh, no, I can't do that. It might be seen as giving you a handout and actually helping you have a better life. It's like, why are you anti that? You know, we need to ask the questions like, why is it so terrible for people to have a good standard of living? Is there a certain way that we believe that there should be haves and have-nots? And how comes it's always the same select few and everybody else that's turfed out? And I do believe that allyship and being a co-conspirator, actually, you know, like getting involved and saying that this is not something that's going to happen on my watch, because courage calls on to courage. And if I stand up for you and you stand up for me and everybody else, like we stand up for each other, something has to be done, because we will force them to change. Yeah, but we have to do it together, and we have to look beyond what separates us and realize that we are all being eaten alive.
Thank you. Stef, anything you want to add to that?
I think that was very good. I always think the difficulty with allyship is, well, I don't want to say we can't all be allies to everything, because we can, in the sense that we have the attitude of supporting people who are oppressed or struggling in some way. But at the same time, we all also have only so much brain space and so much time in our lives, and we can't all practically contribute to every single issue in the world. So I think there's partly a general attitude of wanting to support people, but also then in terms of practicalities, possibly just pick one issue, perhaps one that's local to you, or one that through a family or friend connection is particularly personal to you, and go and get involved. So like with Nadine talking about the young people that are on the edge of criminality, well, Nadine can correct me, but it sounds like what they need are places to go and people to be there to open those places, make sure the resources are available to them, give them, you know, things to be doing with their time. Or if it's someone who's disabled, so I organise a group of healthy people who go and clear overgrown gardens in my neighbourhood, because I can see that that's an issue. And there's times when I'm really tired that what I need is one of my friends to cook a meal for me or come and take my dog out for me. So there's things where you can just pick one issue and go and serve people practically, even if it's the very lowest level of cleaning toilets at the local night shelter. Start there, and then over time, as the relationships build with the people that you're helping, that's when you can start finding out, you know, what are the wider systemic issues, what could be campaigned on, and listen to them, to what they say the problems are and what they think the solutions are, and start working together. You know, you might then go and talk to your local MP or your local councillor. But I guess, yeah, I think starting at the bottom with the practical stuff,
Thanks.
just pick one issue and get involved and get to know the people.
Yeah, thanks, Steph. I've been given a nudge there on time. So if it's all right, Nadine, I'll jump down to the floor. If you've got any questions from the floor, anybody wants to jump in with? I can't see. There's a gentleman here on the front row with a baseball cap on.
Employment's a big issue for people with disabilities and chronic illnesses, and there's not much chance of this government doing anything about it. Like I said, they're not for us. But if what would you ask a decent government to do to support people with disabilities and chronic illnesses to get into employment, to level the playing field, because it's a very unlevel playing field at the moment?
Yeah, shall I?
Yeah.
Quite a bit of my research is on that question. I think the very first thing, from the people I've been talking to, is often financial security and stability. So to start off, we need enough money to live off, and we need to know that we're going to have it for long enough, because that's when you've got the space and the freedom to start trying other things. And then once you've got that financial security and, you know, enough to live off, that's when you can start exploring perhaps either a very part-time role, like 4-5 hours a week, or a voluntary or community role, something that's very flexible, something that is often project-based rather than So instead of having like deadlines each week, it's more of a, here's a project and you've got as long as you need, depending on, because we know your health might vary. And the government needs to support up front to do that. So the Access to Work scheme is very slow, very, very slow, and you have to actually be in employment. So there's nothing for people who want to do voluntary work or community work but need support to do that. So I think the government should be funding unpaid work as well, and they should be committed to doing it up front. And then you should probably have access to occupational therapists, because they're the ones who are trained to say, actually, what can you do and what support do you need to do it? And then once you can then, with that, the few hours that you're perhaps doing, paid or unpaid, with your occupational therapist, you can be looking to see what support actually helps you and just build up slowly from there. But you absolutely need the financial stability at home to live off, and you need the upfront commitment from the government to provide the support that you need and to identify the support that you need. And you need that space to be able to reach your limit, because sometimes the government just expects you to keep going and building up forever, whereas actually if you've got a chronic illness, there's a limit to what you can do, and the government needs to be like, okay, you can only work so many hours, we're not ever going to ask you to do more than that.
Thanks, Stef. We've got time for one more question, and then we're going to go on to here, Tishani. Sorry, we've got another question down here. So did you, Lisa, and then this person in the front row?
Hi, I'm Lisa. I'm a freelance consultant, amongst other things, and I've worked in the arts sector for 25 years, mainly in communications. It's been really a privilege to hear what you've had to say today, and I did watch the celebratory launch of Manchester Poverty Commission's report, and I've done a lot of thinking during COVID lockdown, and it's more of a kind of thing to say maybe than a question, maybe a provocation, that in the arts sector, we have had this history of definition of marginalised people or hard to reach people, and this was picked up earlier. And I think that the sector's done a lot towards inclusion. And I was just thinking, wouldn't it be interesting if we turned that on its head and we saw ourselves as a sector that was hard to reach? We saw ourselves as a sector that was disengaged, and flipped it, and what that might look like in terms of actual engagement. That was my one point. And the second one is in relation to neurodiversity, regarding Leanne's contribution, and how important I think it is now, with the recognition of mental health issues. I'm not lumping neurodiversity in with mental health issues, but I'm saying that there is a movement now to understand and recognise neurodiversity, and in communications in particular. I've been very mindful around communications, looking at organisations with regards to dyslexia particularly, websites, accessible literature, flowcharts, pictures. Get rid of loads of text about this artist and that artist, and look at communications differently. So I think that there's an interesting point in time for us to do looking at communications accessibility, disability, poverty, with regards to communications primarily here.
Thanks, Lisa, for that statement. And for the last word in the front row here.
Thank you so much to the speakers for your contributions. I'm curious to hear, because you've referred to systemic issues as well as sort of more grassroots matters and how individuals and communities can come together to support people. What do you say to, the bureaucratic processes and the bureaucrats really, who say, things take time. We have to launch all these inquiries and all of this research to back up the sustainability of projects that we want to launch, to, let's say, extend how access to work is offered and how it's delivered. Because there is very unfortunately, a nugget of truth in the necessity to substantiate certain work being conducted over a long period of time being a thing that is established and unquestioned. So I'm just curious to hear from your experience how you would challenge that, because as someone who is very much in support of the work that you do and someone who would benefit from the work that you do as a disabled person myself, that's one that I keep coming up against, and I would really like to have something tangible to come back to governments and bureaucrats with.
Thank you. Anybody got a one-sentence answer to that question?
Yeah, one sentence. It doesn't take time, it takes resources. Look how quickly we got the COVID vaccine out. Yeah. And we've done decades of research, like the Labour Party did loads when they were in power. What it takes is the political will to look at the data we've already got and put that into practice.
Okay, thank you. Good point to end on, I think. So, very quickly summarise, what can we do to make a difference? I've been making notes as we're going along here. So I'm going to start by saying seeing and hearing each other. Sounds obvious, but nevertheless, the obvious is often worth saying. We need to make an effort to be better, to better understand the needs of those who've been made invisible and how we can make them seen. We can make sure that we confront exclusionism by being inclusive. Culture's got a vital role to play in telling stories that enable us to see and be seen. And the big takeaway from this, I think, is get some skin in the game. Yes. I was lucky enough last night to be in the audience to hear Tishani Doshi read I See You, You See Me. It's a fantastic poem, and it's her response to Article 6 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So I'm now going to hand you over to Tishani. Welcome.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. Dave, I can only see you, so okay.
Yeah, we can hear you, yeah.
Great. Okay. So my name is Tishani Doshi, and it's been such a pleasure to listen to this conversation today. I chose Article 6, which states everyone has the right to recognition everywhere as a person before the law. And it seems such an obvious, simple, basic right, and yet so complicated on so many levels. I think of the difficulty of knowing oneself, which from Socrates to Vedanta has worried and concerned us as human beings to know ourselves and how we are often chasing after ourselves, and the magic of finding ourselves in strangers when we do see them and they see us. So it started as a very intimate poem, but then I began reading, and the question of seeing and the politics of seeing in this age of surveillance, where there are a billion surveillance cameras in the world, where our data is being used, our biometric information, there's drones, there's cyber surveillance, how this data is being manipulated and used. Then the politics of seeing what is hidden, how is it all controlled? It takes it into another level. And so I think my poem was trying to bring together this very intimate question of knowing oneself and recognition with this age of surveillance that we live in. And so this is called I See You, Do You See Me? Once I was a boy in a frock. Once I was a girl struggling to climb out of a pool. I met myself at a seaside holiday. Remember that moment in childhood when you were innocent and then you were not. Remember what it was to look at the world after, how the doorway shifts and you deposit both selves in a lost and found box, the relief of discovery, of disappearing. You see me, don't you? I'm the one hanging photographs in a dark room, archiving the forest of myself. There's a gap between us the size of a sphinx. In this feathery winter light, the doorway shifts again. The aerial prints of my life expose all the secrets I wanted to hide. If this were a play, we'd be getting to the point where you recognize me and I recognize you. All the masks slip and everything is remade. Father killed, mother married. But listen, this is not Aristotelian tragedy. Let's not end in a bloodbath. We could return to the kingdom triumphant instead. After so many years of being lost, We could be twins with identical birthmarks, climb off the boat and leave our vests on the shore, make mud images of ourselves and return them to the sea, the way an idol is immersed and sent home after a stay with devotees. There is always the promise of a night sky, the what you are twinkle of a billion stars and surveillance cameras, a dizzying, pixelated universe, our biometric futures miniaturized on a grain of sand. What could be difficult about saying, I see you, I see you, I see you?
Thank you. That was beautiful, thank you. So, I'd also like to say thank you to our panel members, if we can show our appreciation in the usual way. Thank you. And remind you there's plenty more to see and to be part of, and I'd particularly commend to you this evening the second part of the Poetic Declaration and the third part tomorrow. So thank you for coming and participating, and I apologise for overrunning. It's all my fault, but it was interesting. So have a good afternoon and evening.